Well,
Yeah,
thanks so much, for being here, for wanting to talk with me, for wanting to join in this Loops podcast. I really appreciate it. I've been doing this project
absolutely.
for about like 5 years. So you're releasing a new album here as Kiltro very soon with your
Mhm.
band. I think it'd be really great to know, especially for me to know, just like how long you've been making music as Kiltro and why this project sort of originated.
Um, so it's been, I don't actually know exactly how many years, but uh, I mean, I've been writing music for a long time, and I think the name Quiltro didn't come about until I was already, so I was living in Chile for a few years. And at the time, Quiltro was like this idea of, it basically, what it means is street dog. It's sort of, it's Chilean slang for street dog, or like a mutt, or just like a mixed breed dog of, and in Valparaíso, this town where I lived, it was absolutely full of them. It's like one for every 10 people. And so there's tons and tons of dogs, and it's very much like a part of your daily life there to be around dogs, and they have their own kind of areas and hills that they live on, and they'll get to know you and sort of follow you around and stuff, and pack sometimes, and even get the it's really cool to actually see dogs like out in just in a city surviving on their own. And it's like a really unique thing, because obviously here we only see them with like owners and knowing their little family structure,
Yeah,
but
that would never fly
like
here.
they're like, they'll meet you on, they'll see you, and it's like, hey, what's up, man? They'll like greet you and then leave because they're going somewhere else, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
uh, and I think in the early days like that, I think, so I originally wanted to do something that was sort of an homage to the city, which I very much fell in love with, and it was going to be this collection of short stories. And I basically drafted, a bunch of um, just different ideas, and had written like, I mean, a decent amount of certain ones of those stories, and so the idea was to create this like homage to Valparaíso, where you had something that was about a place but told from a multitude of different perspectives, and that had this kind of like, um, maybe somewhat surreal quality, and just was inspired by the place. And at the same time, I was writing a lot of songs, and I just got this guitar, and so they just sort of bled into each other until one sort of became the other. And that was, I don't know, 2015 or so. I later like um, I moved back to the States, and then I lived in London for a little while, and was just doing open mics and playing out a lot, um, and solo for a long time. Picked up the looping thing, which became kind of part of the act. And then I don't think it didn't become a band properly until the same year we released our first album. Meanwhile, Will had been living. He was teaching English in Vietnam, and we've been
Okay.
keeping in touch because we met in college before I moved to Chile. Um, and yeah, and so we were keeping in touch. He was liking the music, and then at one point he was like, "Hey, man, if you ever need somebody to play with," and I was a little bit fed up of doing the solo thing, so I invited him to play a few shows, and it was kind of one of those things where I don't think we ever like solidly said like, "Yeah, let's do this together now." It was just sort of assumed, because I'd wanted to play with Will for a while, and so when it aligned that we were both in the same place, then I invited him to be a part of it, and we got Michael DiVincenzi, our drummer, along not so long after. He had met Will separately, and um, he joined in, probably, I mean, like a few months after that, and yeah. And meanwhile, we were recording the first album.
By the way, I feel like
20.
people should know that I'm also Chilean, so there's
Oh,
like a
right,
lot
yeah,
of there's a lot of fun stuff that Chris and I can talk about. Like I remember the stray dogs as well, and like being young in my neighborhood and seeing Dobermans just like walking around and like being terrified by
totally.
them.
And like poodles too. You'll see like
Yes,
poodles.
very nice, like very cute little dogs as well.
But in any case, yeah, to answer your question, like, I would say that the original concept of having the dogs be this uniting factor in a city of disparate perspectives and stories, was like at the root of what I was interested in at the time. And the name Quiltro also obviously has other kind of meanings for me, in that like I'm of a mixed background, and the songs themselves are of a mix of genres and styles, and I never wanted to be sort of to be stuck in like rock or indie or Latin music, especially. Not especially, but among the many titles, like sometimes it's like funny the way you get thrown in to, get put in certain shows and places because of that title. But
Sure.
so I think it had like a personal dimension, and it was also descriptive of the music, and it just felt like the perfect name. So it just sort of evolved in that way. But yeah, originally it was going to be like a series of short stories. Um,
Yeah. No, that's
yeah,
great. And I think it's really interesting because but the place, the setting and the place and the history that you're kind of like calling back to with your music is really important, right? To the music that you're making. But I'm really curious to know kind of like personally now, because I'm assuming you're in, are you in Denver or Colorado?
I am. Yeah,
Yeah. I just would be great to know like how would you describe your relationship to like Chile now?
I haven't been in a while, and part of it's because of I mean, obviously because of COVID, being wrapped up here with the album and with touring. So I imagine you must kind of have a similar experience sometimes, right? It's like being,
Well, it's been years. Yeah, it's been since
yeah,
2017 since I was there,
really, is that the
you
last
know?
time you're
Hmm.
there? Yeah. And it was, yeah, and during COVID, it was quite a difficult thing, you know. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think sometimes I feel I definitely want to go back, you know. Um, I can't in the immediate future with everything we got going on, but of course I would love to go back. Um, it's a part of my identity for sure. Um, but that definitely gets like a little estranged from you over time, when you're not visiting regularly and seeing the community there that you identify as part of your background as well, or that that like facet of my personality that's just sort of not something I'm kind of feeding, right? That's a weird thing to have that be somewhere else and to not have that direct contact with it. So yeah, it's a strange thing, especially we're using the name quiltro and the music is of a particular style at times, and so it does, yeah, certainly feels a little alienating to be away. But it's also like a part of, it's also a part of, I think it's been a part of my life, you know, for forever, kind of
Yeah.
feeling sort of not always a little bit like, oh, well, part of like my identity is somewhere else, um, and then you go to that other place and everyone calls you gringo because he's like, just because, I'm sure if going back to Chile, everyone's going to call you gringo,
Yeah.
you know?
It's
Um,
very strange just given I mean, I don't know how your situation is, but just having a lot of family there and not really being able to make those connections that you would
yeah,
want to make. It seems like you were kind of going back pretty often to work and go to different places, right? You know, before the
but
pandemic.
I was also kind of the black because all my cousins are Chilean, and I'd go down there and I was also a little bit like the black sheep, being the one whose parents had moved to the United States and then
Yeah.
coming back. And so I got the gringo thing like since I was little, you know. Um and yeah, I don't know if that was your experience as well, right?
It
Kind of,
it definitely was. Yeah.
I'm sure you got all of that stuff. So
Yeah, and again, the older that you get, the more it's somehow like the further removed you get from that, but also I'm much more interested now in wanting to be kind of invested in Chilean culture and getting in touch with family and things like that. And that's sort of what I get with your music as well. I would love to talk about the new album because
yeah,
you mentioned it's of a particular style, but I mean, I think there's like, I mean, I feel like first of all, it sounds really, really nice. It's really well produced. I love the little guitar lines that you kind of have going in through a couple of little songs that sound like cumbia guitar lines almost, like the kind
okay.
of psychedelic sound.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I get the Jaivas vibes for sure when I listen to it.
cool. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Why is it important for you to make those references in your music?
Yeah, I think it's just something that, it's just a style that interested me. And I think it just sort of found its way into what we were doing. I think, Chilean musicians of that era, of like the 60s, 70s, had such like dynamism in their melodies. And I think it's always something I've wanted to kind of capture in our music. Rhythmic or not, there's like a sort of emotional wildness at time I would say that Victor Jara has like a lot of that, you know, where it's like the vocal melodies are always going way up and the way down. They're very cantadito, you know. And so I think that was always something that I loved. Like in our first album, there was a bunch of stuff like that. We're definitely inspired by Victor Jara. I would say Ursula was very inspired by him. And yeah, I think it's just interest finding their way into the music. I'm not sure that I feel like necessarily beholden to those influences, but at times I have sort of thought like, oh well, if we stray from that, is that going to be, you know? But they find their way back in one way or another, and I think that Latin music is so ubiquitous as well, and there's so many different ways, you know, to sort of um, I don't know, like work in certain sounds and to give things that kind of vibiness. And I also think that on some level musically, I'm just at this point kind of thinking in those terms as well. A lot of songs
Yeah.
get written with a sort of like cueca, which is like a Chilean, you know, folk style um, rhythm sort of baked into them. Or, you know, I love those like single held almost Manu Chao notes. And Manu Chao is like, you know, Spanish, French, but he also spent a ton of time in Latin America, and his sound is very Latin American too.
Yeah.
Uh, those kinds of things, you know, and then mixed with obviously like the more Western influences that I, you know, would listen to more in like high school and in college, and like Deer Hunter and Radiohead, and you know, more recently like Moses Sumney.
Yeah,
So
there's a lot of fun little outros to a couple of these songs too, where those sounds kind of like clash and decay, and that reminds me a lot of like, well, just those influences that you were kind of talking about. And I think Latin rock, in a sense, just kind of compiles all those things, anyways, all those things, and it kind of
sure.
comes into this
Yeah.
very individual, kind of very mixed genre.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of people growing up in Latin America, you know, I think they grow up being intimately familiar with the sort of greats from their culture, but then also like randomly, at least in Chile too, like you'll have people who like know who like Dirty Projectors are, or like you know, or I don't know, or Deer Hunter, or you
Oh,
know, anything.
Radiohead, giant Radiohead fans over in Chile.
Oh yeah, people love Radiohead.
I'm really curious to kind of know that, because you were mentioning some of the people that you were kind of working with that make a part of Quiltro, your band. Is it, you know, how do you go about fleshing these songs and these ideas with the band? Do you share similar influences with them, or is it kind of like an education to kind of let them know a little bit about the things that you're wanting to write about and feel the influences from?
I feel like probably when it comes to like the Chilean bands, you know, I'm usually the one who's coming to like I showed Will, you know, Victor Jara and Violeta Parra and Inti Gimani and like all these kind of random Chilean acts and stuff from the 70s. But Will has shown me a lot more bands because he's got like an encyclopedic knowledge of just, you know, I mean, music in general. He knows so much music. So, you know, and he already had influences from other cultures and backgrounds. He loves like Georgie Ben, and a lot of like Brazilian music. And he introduced me to a whole bunch of stuff.
It's
Um,
easy for him to pick up something that, you know, is a different style, or something that you're trying to
yeah,
express.
I would say that the thing we both like about a song tends to be the same thing, you know? Like I would trust Will to go and like listen to a bunch of music by a particular artist, and the ones that he's going to consider his favorites would probably be the ones I'd pick too. That kind of thing. So like yeah, he probably listens to a lot more of a broad range of things. I think we have in common a certain sensibility about music. And then in the van, it's like everything. I mean, Michael's like a very musical person and also very musically literate as well. And so is Fez, right? Hunter and Jack, our sound guys, are as well. So it's like I'm surrounded by people that know music really, really, really well,
Nice.
and that have a really wide taste in music, and also really good taste in music. So I don't think anything that I've brought to the table has like been like surprising or weird to anyone.
How do you, for example, with Underbelly, how do you go about sort of fleshing those songs out with the band?
Oh, yeah. So Underbelly was a unique one. I mean, we only have the two albums to go off of. I don't even know what we would have done otherwise, you know, if it hadn't been like basically a quarantine album or album born in quarantine. But yeah, with Underbelly, so those I wrote like in basically a room, and you know, they were produced at my house and recorded at my house for the most part,
During the
except for some,
pandemic?
yeah, during the pandemic. And I was experimenting with kind of a new way of making music for me, because before it was all on an acoustic guitar and a lot and with a looper as well. So it was, kind of the fragments of audio loop back. This was a bit more like Sergeant Pepper's, in the sense that we were just sort of like making something just out of nothing, and a lot of the song ideas that became solid later were just like, I would say every single song on the album has like the demo tracks in it, because it was made like in the studio. And so it was a really different process from the first time, where we had like a chance to sort of, I wrote the songs and then I could bring them out live and test them with an audience and see what was kind of sticking and working, and then putting that together, and trying to be loyal to what we were doing live and all that. Like that dialogue
Yeah.
wasn't really Underbelly. Underbelly was much more born, I think, in a studio. And it gave me, more room to like experiment, so I got to like mess around with different sounds and try my chops at production, and went like all in on that, which has been a challenge adapting it live. But I'd say the band stepped in, aside from Will, who was there, giving his sort of feedback, and which was a really like important thing for me in that era, especially as we were doing things that were just weirder. But yeah, then we had Michael come and listen, and he would just sort of mess around and try different things, and we went with the kind of approach of just going a little bit blind, and then because Michael's really intuitive in that way, where if you just throw something at him, he'll respond and do some brilliant thing. For Guanaco, it's all pots and pans, right? So we gave him a bunch of pots and pans, and we had him just like, we laid them out by timbre, and then before we knew it, was doing these really intricate, really cool things. And so the whole idea was just to take little snippets of that and situate them in the song in such a way that you could kind of like manage the momentum in different sections, but also like build and release tension and all that. And that's the most fun that I have, like, I think in the studio, is like when somebody's just doing something. Like me and Will had so many moments like that. But yeah, I would say it's a little bit like, I tend to write the compositions. I like defer to Will on a lot of things, just to kind of give me insight into what it is that I'm working on. And then at a certain stage, I start like introducing it to the rest of the band and seeing like, what else does it need? And then it's like 2 years of just producing it to death and bleeding a stone until something comes out of it. We had like a ton of song ideas for this album. It was like 20 something, song demos that we then whittled down.
You,
But yeah,
you whittled it down into Underbelly, and I almost hate to ask this, but like, what does that title mean to you, and why did you end up selecting these 10 songs?
so we wanted to, so we were very particular about like the song order, and also just the like how well they fit together and how well they seem to tell a kind of story from start to finish. Whether there's any specific narrative or not, I think the idea is just always to create like a cohesive world that you can sort of live in, that has like pockets and spaces that you might not have thought we would like create, but that are there anyway. And so it's like kind of taking you by surprise, while at the same time feeling cohesive, right? So finding the songs that could do that, and then sort of making them do that with a lot of work on like the ambient side of things and all that. That was sort of the first thing. And I think the name Underbelly was the name of a song first before we named it the album. But I think it was an allusion to the fact that, this was, there's a few reasons, a few ways it resonates in my mind. And one of those is like, we're passing through this period, whether it's culturally or individually, of like of this quarantine, of this intense psychological space. Like this album to me feels a lot more turned inward. I think Creatures of Habit was like very much about stories taking place in a location that had maybe a kind of magical realist quality to it, but this one is a lot more about like what happens when everything kind of stops and suddenly there's all this internal noise. And that's like that to me is kind of like the underbelly of what we're all passing through, either like I said, either as a culture or individually, and where that line is, it's hard to tell with like the sort of noise of the outside world and like internal noise that bubbles up. And so yeah, I think it's a much more personal album in the sense that I think like a lot of those songs are like, oh yeah, that's kind of what it felt like, for me, just being in a room, and then, and so and the process was very internal, in the sense that where we didn't have an audience to bounce these ideas off of. Like all of it has this kind of, and I think that's why like there's a sort of cat trope on it too, of this. Yeah, I just feel like that felt like a really apt thing, having Cuchito on there too.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I think that there's still a lot of like mystique around the album itself and the way that it sounds. Like even if you say that your previous album was sort of like that intention, I still hear that a lot with Underbelly. And like Guanaco in particular, I think is a really interesting song, because I didn't even know those were like pots and pans, but that's really cool that that's actually how they were recording in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the end I can kind of hear sirens. Is that true?
Yeah. So you probably know like what a Guanaco is, or like, or what it means in Chile. It's like a slang word for like a police vehicle.
I didn't know that actually. I knew about the animal, the little llama for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. They call it a Guanaco because everything in Chile is like animal related slang. They have like, el Guanaco is like it's like the police vehicle that shoots water, because Guanacos spit, right? The Guanaco is like an alpaca or a llama, and so the idea with the song was just to, I mean, it says, it's like the lyrics are "Ya viene el Guanaco," and also at protest they bang pots and pans, so that's
Oh
how
yeah.
we use pans as the percussive thing. And I think what we wanted to do was just sort of depict what it's like to, that state of like communal anxiety or something, or the feeling of like an impending thing that's coming. And I also just like the line, like "Here comes the Guanaco," has like almost like a like a almost like a mythological quality
Yeah,
to it.
like a horror tale almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like and here it comes, like rather than be sort of explicitly political on one side or the other. It was inspired by the protests in 2019. It's actually the oldest song on the album. And it was written, I think, pretty soon after we finished Creatures. So it was like a pretty different song. And obviously at that time, I was imagining that I was going to do a series of songs in that kind of vein, And I think that it fits now on this album in a really lovely way. And probably what I was imagining would have made it for like something a bit more contrived. But I think it's a good way of setting the stage for like, it's that, I don't know. I like it because it has this like internal anxiety in the context of like a social crazy thing that's happening, and I think that's sort of like very much the tone of what Underbelly is kind of going for on some level.
Yeah, I think the record kind of puts you in that world when you start with like Guanaco. There's also like a really nice release to it too, because it is almost like it is a dance track, in my opinion.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of our more sort of dancey percussive. It was like our set ender for a long time,
Yeah.
Where after we played on the encore or something before wrapping up the set. So and people always like responded to it, and so we knew we had to capture the sort of rhythm of it. And I think the first draft, we couldn't like figure out what was missing, because it just felt a little bit lifeless or something. And then, we just started adding a ton of stuff, and later it became like a whittling down process. I think when we handed over to a mixing engineer, it was like, sorry, there's so much stuff. But yeah, it ended up in a really good place.
Yeah, it's one of those songs that I feel you can have it jam out for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, however long you want with that beat. It's very nice.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm really curious too, because it's like, you're playing a lot of shows in the United States, right? So you mentioned this being a very like these personal inward feelings that you're sort of bringing out in your music with rhythm. I mean, how do you expect, or like how do you want the audience to sort of like receive a lot of these songs? Is it educational, or is it more of like just a look inside, who you are?
I wouldn't say it's like I love that question, but I wouldn't say it's like educational. I've never like set out to. Do you mean in terms of like the subject matter, or do you mean in terms of like here's a style you haven't heard before, or do you
Yeah,
mean?
I just wonder how the audiences, relate to the music that you make. And I think maybe, what you'd like them to get out of seeing Kiltro, of listening to the record?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure exactly. I think I want there to, I want it to be a transportive work that, that obviously I want there to be moments of like some kind of emotional difficulty and catharsis, but I'm not sure that I went into it thinking I wanted people to take a specific thing from it. I think it's more like as I was writing it, I was always searching for that thing, you know?
For yourself?
Kind of, yeah. I would say like obviously we're like it's never like a purely like solitary thing, because like music is by definition like a social, it's all social, so as you're sitting down to do something, you're doing it like with an audience in mind, and there's a craft to that, and we want to be really attentive to the craft because there's definitely a way of listening that you have to sort of either put yourself in the shoes of like, and that becomes especially important as you're like in the production mixing phase. You don't want to lose like the spark of the thing or get it like convoluted in the process or anything by adding too much and being like, what's this song about again? But yeah, I mean, I would say like as I'm writing the songs, I'm looking for the thing that's going to make me feel emotional about it, because I think when you capture that kind of vulnerability, then people just naturally feel that way too, right? Because they feel somebody like searching for the right chord or searching for the right melody, and there's like an authenticity to that, right? Rather than contriving a specific thing that people are supposed to get from it, or that they're going to hear it in this way, and then they're going to think this thing. I like when those things kind of happen, like by accident, or when you think like, oh, that's great, I love that, because
Just
that
listening to it, consuming it,
yeah,
in a live
just
setting, for example.
quality at all, and I think that's like you want to preserve that, otherwise it's hard to continue doing it.
Yeah. Can you give me another example of, like, for example, in Underbelly, one of the songs that really does hit you like that, and what sort of feelings it builds up in you?
Uh, well, there's parts of Underbelly, the song, that it's hard to. I mean, I would say that all the songs have some moment that makes, I mean, not even just
Yeah.
a moment. Some of them, like they were chosen for that reason too, because upon listening back to them, I'm like, oh, they make me feel that way. But there's songs that I'm like kind of particularly interested in still, while I listen back and be like, I can't, yeah, it's so like I can't believe we made that. That's awesome. I would say like Softy is one of those songs, and Kerosene is one of those songs. I don't imagine Kerosene to be like a fan favorite, but it's probably one of mine just because I love the way I played with time on that one. And I like the way that the samples kind of, that we did like the sample work on it. And I like Will did some wonderful like work with the cello, and then we ran that through a bunch of crazy effects to, pitch them up and down to do these crazy descending things. And that's in Softy as well. And that sort of, it sounds like a violin or like a bunch of violins. But what it was a cello run through this thing called a count to five, which is like this little pedal
Okay.
that takes like a sample of something and you can pitch it up and down, and then have the starting point and length of it be randomized. So it was just doing this kind of repeating like descending line. And it sounded, because it was a pitched up cello, like a violin. And we like layered a bunch of those in a certain way so that they would kind of descend and then come back up and then descend. And it gave the song like this emotional weight and tension that was really surprising and really cool. I probably another one of those moments was we played like, I mean, in Kerosene, like there's this, I forget what exactly it was, but it sounds like somebody wailing. I think it's just me yelling into a mic and then run through a ton of fuzz. Um, and it's actually the transition from Softy into Kerosene, but it's like, because Kerosene has this kind of waltzy, pleasant quality to it. And it's got, it's not like a fast-paced percussive song, although I mean it's very percussive, but it's not like a upbeat by any means. It's one of the more like maybe folkier, it's not really folky, but I would say it has that kind of vibe to it. It's a bit more like intimate in a way. And then there's this like screaming voice kind of happening underneath. And there was something about like, it was like the feeling of, and if that one felt very true to, like to quarantine, being in a room and being like, I think I'm okay, Um, so I don't know. There's a lot of little moments like that I think Will and I were like, that's so great. Cuchito is that way too. When Will's bass line in that is unbelievable. He went from like this straight cumbia bass line, but because it's in seven, it has this really unnatural feeling. Sort of the way it cycles is like really unique, and the fills he does are like awesome. So we were really in love with that song from the beginning. It's the reason it was the first thing we released.
I mean, I
But
think
yeah,
that gives it the big psychedelic kind of aspect to it. And when you think
totally.
about other Latin rocks, like it's not just straight four on the floor, you know?
Right. Yeah, that one was like we were trying to make like a cumbia song and seven, that was about my cat. So it was a nice, like, light-hearted thing. And I think it's a great album ender for that reason. Because actually, when you put it at the end of the album, we discovered that it had this feeling of like a sort of wave goodbye thing that was happening that gave
Neat.
it this extra added meaning. And it's like one of the more like I would say like uplifting songs, despite there being like a car crash that happens in the middle of it, and but it's like this very yeah, that one also had that to it as well.
Sounds like you had a lot of fun in the studio,
We did.
twisting knobs and making things work.
Yeah, it was fun.
That's great. So, okay, Underbelly is out in a couple of weeks since we're recording this, June 2nd, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're gonna have a release show on the day before here in Denver.
Yeah,
Cool.
at the cafe, which is really special because that's the first place I ever did a quiltro show. Um, and it's also where our drummer Fez and his wife Sufi got married. So
Wow.
yeah, so it's kind
Okay.
of perfect venue.
Mercury Cafe with Nina DeFreitas.
That's right.
Cool. Are you looking forward to it? Like, what should people expect?
I am looking forward to it. It's nice because we chose a venue that is a bit more of an intimate setting. And I think it's a really nice way to do an album release instead of trying to go for like, some big show with a ton of, I think it's going to be something. It's not like yeah, it's like a lower stake show for us. So I feel like we can all kind of relax a bit and have just like a really good time. So I think that's the thing that I'm looking forward to is just kicking off the whole tour season with a show like that.
Yeah, then you're getting on the road.
Yeah, a couple weeks later.
Well, what the last question that I want to ask is because it's called loops, obviously. So I like to ask the people that I interview, what is your favorite loop? Whether that's a song or like a beat or something that you made, like what's one of the loops that always sticks in your mind?
Uh Favorite loops. I mean, I would say, I guess I'll go with something off the album.
Yeah,
Not
sure.
looped audio of all time. Probably that's something Bradford Cox did, but um, or like a Radiohead thing. But yeah, I think at the end of, I want to say it's at the end of Kerosene. There's this kind of ascending melody thing that's happening. Um, you know what? It might be at the end of What Gives. It's funny that I can't remember, but I can picture sound right in my head really clearly, and it's like this kind of melody that sort of goes up and then stop. And it's again, it was recorded with that same pedal, so it's randomized. So sometimes it completes the phrase, and other times it stops short and then does this weird thing and then starts it over again. And there's something like really, it just gets me hooked on it. Like it's like my brain is just wants to keep listening to it, and
Yeah,
it's
it's
just
very entrancing.
yeah, those kind of things. Yeah,
Okay, I'll have to listen to the album again and then see if I can find it and which song it's
yeah.
on.
Song it's on.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks so much for wanting to talk with me and being here. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, just said it was lovely to talk to you, man. And then like we should get a drink or something soon. And thanks for having me on your show. Appreciate it.
Please. Yeah, let's do it. It's been too long. I guess whenever you find some little breaks in the touring, it'd be fun to hang out.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to.
Sweet.